Hello and welcome everybody. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble an entire bike from a frame and a fork. So I'm going to get my gloves on so we don't get too dirty and so we don't get the frame too dirty. And I'm going to show you, this is a frame that I built last year. I actually built the frame from our frame building class here at Cooley. Painted it this nice rainbow fade, just with regular old spray paint. Here's the fork that I also built. So this is gonna go together like this with a nice fade from red to purple at the back. But we need to get this thing assembled. And to begin with any bike, not just a spray painted bike, but particularly with the spray painted bike, we don't want to clamp the bike in the stand. So the frame has never actually been clamped into place. That will damage the paint, and in the case of a carbon fiber bike, or even some lightweight steel or aluminum bikes, that could actually damage the frame. So the first thing we're going to do to get started here is we're going to mount a seat post into the frame, and then we're going to clamp by the seat post to hold the frame in the stand. So first and foremost, we need to have a seat post clamp. This does not have an integrated seat post clamp on it. So as you can see, the top of the seat tube of the frame is just bare. There's no bolt. We have a seat post clamp here. It's important to keep in mind that you have to order the seat post clamp that matches the diameter of your seat tube on your frame. These come in all different sizes depending on the material and the bike and the builder's choice and whatnot. So we have measured this already. We know that it's 30 millimeters exactly, and I purchased a 30 millimeter seat clamp, which is going to fit perfectly over the outside of the frame. Now it should fit snugly, but without the bolt tightened. We don't want the bolt to be tightened on there, but it should fit snugly and firmly over the outside of the frame there. Now I'm going to take some regular old grease and grease the inside of the seat tube here just to protect the seat post from rusting or corroding into place. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I have some grease handy on my bench here, and I'm just going to use the acid brush that was inside the grease just to spread a pretty liberal amount of grease onto the inside of the seat tube. You always want to grease the inside of the seat tube and not the seat post, because the edge of the seat tube will act as a squeegee and just squish off any grease that you put on the seat post. If you put the grease inside the seat post will insert and actually push grease further down into the seat tube and ideally coat the whole thing in its connection with the bike. That way it won't rust into place over time. I'm going to take my seat post, again, pre-measured to know that it matches the frame. In this case, it's a 27.2 millimeter seat post, very common size. It's going to match this frame perfectly. And we're going to put it into place. And for the time being, I'm not being picky about where it is. I have my size measurements that I'll lay out later. But for the time being, I'm just going to leave enough of this sticking out to get a clamp onto. And I'm paying attention to the minimum insert line of the seat post for how far it needs to be into the frame. We want it to go pretty significantly into the frame when we're assembling, because we are going to be putting some torque on the frame as we install certain parts, and we don't want just a tiny bit of seat post showing out of here, or else we could actually damage our bike before we even get a chance to ride it. I'm going to tighten this down. The rating for this is 9 Newton meters. I don't actually have a torque wrench with me, so 9 Newton meters is pretty tight. So I'm just going to go in and tighten this down snugly. I'm not trying to kill anything with it, but we can go pretty tight there. And now we're good to go. We can clamp by the seat post and not worry about damaging the rest of our frame. So I'm going to set the seat post into the clamp of our bike stand and tighten it up. The first thing we would typically do here is install the bottom bracket and the headset. But in this case, since we are going through all of our processes, I'm going to start with my wheels. And I'm going to show you how I'm going to set up my tubes and tires for this bike. So this bike is going to be kind of an all-road bike. You might call it a gravel bike or a cyclocross bike, but it's going to have a 29er mountain bike tire size on it. So we're going a little bit kind of out of the realms of normalcy here by going with a much bigger tire, but it's going to work out, and I'm going to be able to use my old rims in order to do this. Now, one thing that I like to do with most of my bikes, but specifically bikes that I'm going to be riding off-road on, is I like to put sealant into my tubes so that if I get small punctures, say from a small piece of wire or a thorn, it won't just puncture my tube and leave us out in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do. So I'm going to show you how to install the sealant into the tubes and then how to set up the tires on the wheels before we get going. So let's do it. So here I have a standard 29er mountain bike tube. It does have the Presta valve on it, and it's got the 48mm Presta valve, which is a little bit longer than a standard Presta valve. And we're going to open this guy up. We need what's called a removable core valve. So our removable core valve, we're going to take a quick look at the valve stem of the tube, and you can see that the very top edge of this tube has kind of a separate spot on it, and it's got some little wrench flats on it. Now we can use just about anything to open this up. If we had a small adjustable wrench, we could open it with that. If we had a pair of needle nose pliers, we can open it with that. I have found a very useful tool for this is a universal spoke wrench. We're going to use our universal spoke wrench to find exactly the right size, and I nailed it on the first guess there. It's the size 11, in case anybody cares, to open up the outside of this tube. So I'm turning lefty-loosey, and that's going to remove the valve core from the tube itself. Once it's loose enough, we can pop out the valve core just like so. Okay, so that pulls the valve core out, and now we have this open gap approaching into our tube. Now, it helps to kind of manipulate the tube a little bit. It's just come out of the box, might have been kind of stuck together. We're going to kind of manipulate the edges of the tube to really open this up so that our sealant has some place to go when we fill the tube. So I'm going to kind of just open it up and give that sealant somewhere to go. This is Stan's tire sealant. This is actually used for tubeless tires to kind of help hold air inside the tire, but it also works wonders for tubes and resisting small punctures. This little nozzle is going to work perfectly for filling up our tube. Now, once again, we need there to be somewhere for this fluid to go. So if you don't kind of separate the two edges of the rubber, you could end up with sealant blowing back in your face when we fill this up. And I'm actually, this is a 29er bike or tube. It's a pretty big tube. This might be a little bit overkill, but I'm just gonna squeeze in the whole entire tube of this stand. I probably could have done half of that, but since it's a first go, we're just going to do the whole entire thing. I'm then going to take the valve stem and place it back into the tube. Tighten it as far as I can go by hand. Take my number 11 spoke wrench and tighten back down, nice and firm. Now our tube is set to be sealed. I'm going to remove the valve nut from the valve. And then remember, before we put this in the tire, we're going to give it a little bit of air to give it a little bit of shape. So I'm going to grab my pump. I'm going to mount my pump onto the valve stem. Remember, once again, this is a Presta valve, so we need to back out the top of our valve stem, give it a quick tap. We're going to mount it to the pump, and we're just going to give it a few pumps here. So we just want to do enough to give the tube some shape here. I'm going to go grab my tire, but before I do so, I'm going to tighten down that valve so it does not lose air. Here we have the tire that we're going to use. It's a 29er size tire, 29 by 2.1, I believe. And this has a specific rotation direction showing that it should be rotating this way if it is a front wheel, which we're using right now. So I'm going to set my tube into place on my tire. And once again, we always want to line up the valve stem of the tube with the label on the tire. I could go either here or where it says Rapid Rob. In this case, I'm going to match what I did on the rear since my rear is already set, and I'm going to line up the tube or the valve stem with where it says Schwalbe, which is the name of the manufacturer. We're going to line the inside of the tire with the tube. You all recall that process. And here we go. Once again, it's worth noting that the inside of the rim is covered in tape. I'm going to mount the valve stem of the tube into the rim. And this actually is a relatively easy mounting process for this big tire. I'm able to get the whole tire into place easily just by hand. Now, I do want to reinstall my stem nut and tighten into place. I'm going to mount a pump on it. This pump is wonderful. It gives us two options. It gives us a high volume option and a high pressure option. So I'm now set to high volume, which is going to pump a lot of air all at once. And I'm only going to about 40 PSI on this. That's kind of the high edge for mountain bikes. And there we have it. We've got a lot of meat on this tire, so I don't have to worry as much about high tire pressure because the tube is going to be protected by the volume in this tire. I'm going to tighten down my valve, and then if I want to, I can mount my valve stem or my valve cap, and I spin the wheel and check for lumps. If it's really lumpy looking, it means that the tire didn't seat correctly. But this looks really good. There's no obvious dips or rises in it. We are good to go. This is ready to be mounted on the bike. Now, I don't have anywhere to mount it because I don't have a fork on the bike, but we're ready to go when the time should come. And I have already actually completed the process for the rear wheel. So this is the rear wheel with the same style of tire on it, but we're ready to go when the time comes.